Thanks, Anne, for the handover. My name's Lucy. I'm an environmental designer at Atelier 10 and co-chair of Working Group 2, along with Carolyn Nola as my other half for Working Group 2 evaluation. Next slide, please. So our working group has the purpose of contributing to the advancement of measurement and benchmarking around embodied carbon, and our scope covers materials, buildings, and infrastructure. Since sort of around the middle of 2021, we have been tackling this purpose and all its complexity to analyse the opportunities and challenges of using the methodologies to benchmark embodied carbon, and with the real aim, as with all the MECLA working groups, to create assets for industry and evaluate the current state of play. We have a very diverse working group representing designers and suppliers, our tool service providers and database custodians, and as well as leadership members at the industry level. We are currently split, my apologies. We are currently split into 3 subgroups covering our 3 components of scope: the materials and products, the buildings, and the civil linear infrastructure. And each of those is sitting between 10 and 15 key participants. Next slide, please. So as I said, we started off in 2021 with a key exploration of defining our scope and really identifying the spaces where there is support needed and evaluation needed. We landed on 5 areas of evaluation, that being the standards that govern measurement and evaluation of embodied carbon, the quantification methods, how we compare units across the 3 different scopes, that being materials, buildings, and infrastructure, the benchmarking of embodied carbon, and the tools and data that help us do this. So a hefty list to tackle, and spent the next sort of 18 months tackling that in a series of subgroups, with the production of our upfront carbon in the built environment discussion paper as the culmination of that big chunk of work. It went through a number of surveys internally and externally, and we came at the start of this year, we came together to share the insights of that process and our spotlight on measuring embodied carbon. That's recorded and available, as is the discussion paper on the MECLA website. We can go to the next slide. I'll speak briefly to some of the points on the screen, but I'm hoping to tempt you all to, if you haven't read the discussion paper, to dig deep and check it out on the MECLA website. So in the standards, I'll focus on the barriers because I think that's what takes us forward from here. The lessons learned on the standards side of things is that there is a lot of complexity. There are standards that are international or ISO standards, but there are also industry standards that can be really critical in this conversation. But the major takeaway is that the standards associated with broader environmental impact are a separate category to those standards that deal with specifically with carbon and embodied carbon. And that's part of what the work we'll take forward is going to tackle. At the quantification side, barriers include access to data, the consistency or reliability of data, including, of course, navigating paywalls, and the completeness of data and how that aligns with the standards identified in the previous subgroup. So again, this is something we will be taking forward to support industry, particularly those small businesses and new players to materials embodied carbon space. Under comparable units, there's really interesting discussion around which units we use to measure embodied carbon at different scopes and for different core materials, and that this can differ between stakeholders, designers, and practitioners, and at different scales. So again, we see a barrier being consistency, and it's something that we want to take forward, particularly for our civil and linear infrastructure subgroup, where there is a really broad scope of assets being assessed where appropriate comparable units are needed. Under the benchmarking side of things, we have barriers around consistency and agreement on what is low carbon, and that is a broader MECLA challenge that we take on as a consortium. And with the tools and data, transparency and access, again, is a barrier. So looking at the next slide, what we take forward in this year is to try to identify and showcase and advocate for how we fill these gaps, and even just identifying that these gaps do exist to the broader industry. Next slide, please, Lexi. So that is our three subgroups that we've moved forward with. We've got a 90-degree rotation to focus at the scope level and be able to provide key assets for the broader industry, to advocate and guide measurement and evaluation of embodied carbon. And that's what we'll be tackling this year. Next, we've got group 3, and I'll hand over to Jeremy, I believe.